Alrighty, welcome back everyone. I just gave out all of my postseason awards, got to the Heisman. I am going to go Travis Hunter for that, but it should be as close as any Heisman that I can remember. Two remarkable players, and if we could just send those two to New York City, I'd be more than fine with that. But let's get into a little talk around Quinn Ewers and Arch Manning, because this is the big question. As we head into the playoff, there's not a few questions that are more important than this one right here around the Texas Longhorns, and let's jump into this because there's a lot of different things that are going into this. Some of it is reality, some of it not so much. Some of it is a little bit made up by some people out there, but the reality is there are some questions around that quarterback position as we head into the CFP. Do they stick with Quinn Ewers? Do they entirely flip to Arch Manning? How much is Arch Manning a part of the game plan? A lot of different things are being thrown out there. But before we jump into what I think they could possibly do to some of the solutions as far as I see it, let's get into some of the issues that Texas has been facing over the last, really the entire year, but particularly since Quinn Ewers has gotten injured. It's been a little bit of an issue for them all year, and it starts with red zone inefficiency. They have been really, really bad in the red zone, especially towards the back end of this season. They're 93rd in the country when it comes to red zone efficiency, and when you look at the plays inside the Georgia 25-yard line, by the way, huge shout out to CJ Vogel for a lot of the stats that I'm going to use here, because he definitely broke this down in great detail, was very, very helpful to kind of break this down this issue a little bit better. But they had 14 plays inside the Georgia 25-yard line on Saturday. Really, really good. You know, you want as many plays as possible. 2 penalties for negative 25 yards, 2 run plays for 10 yards, 10 pass plays for 0 yards. Those pass plays went 2 for 9, 5 yards, and a sack for negative 5 yards. They were ahead of the chains, quote unquote, on 2 of those 14 snaps. That can't happen. That can't be a reality that you're living in. There's very, very few quarterbacks. There's probably no quarterbacks in the college football world that will succeed with that. There's no world where you're going to be able to stay behind the chains that often, have that many penalties. And yes, you were able to run the ball 2 times for 10 yards. The reality is some of those were after penalties. Some of those were on third down to get in place for a field goal. You're in a position where you do not have confidence in your run game when you get into the red zone. That is a problem. That is something that Quinn Ewers can't necessarily fix, and that is something that Quinn Ewers is going to take the fall for, because he's going to be the guy that has to make essentially all the plays. When they get into the red area, they have to be better at running the ball. They have to stay in front of the sticks. They cannot shoot themselves in the foot with penalties, or they're going to be in a lot of trouble when they get into that red area, and Clemson's going to beat them, plain and simple. If they do not get this fixed up at least a little bit going into that game, Clemson's going to take full advantage, and Dabo Swinney is going to be fully ready for what that red zone inefficiency brings. He's going to be ready on the other side to make sure they are efficient in that red zone. So this is probably the biggest issue for Texas. If they do not get this fixed, they will lose very early in this tournament, whether it's Clemson, whether it's Arizona State, or maybe you make it to the quarterfinal or the semis and then you lose to an Oregon or an Ohio State. But the reality is you got to get this fixed one way or another. And then you do have a consistent run game problem. You haven't been able to get it going really nearly as much as you want to. It felt like it was heading in the right direction in the Arkansas, Kentucky, and A&M games. And then in Georgia, you went 2.52 yards per rush, excluding sacks, obviously, on Saturday, and your average distance on third down was 11.6 yards. You're not going to be able to succeed if you cannot get that run game rolling downhill, particularly on first and second down, and be able to set yourself up with 5 yards to go on third down, with 4 yards to go on third down, because that's when Quinn Ewers can really go to work. That's when Quinn Ewers is outright special and one of the better quarterbacks in the entire country. If you can keep him in front of the sticks with your run game, he can do really, really special things and lead you to a national title by himself, if I'm being totally honest. The question is, can you get that without adding Arch Manning to the mix, without getting more numbers in the run game with that? Another big-time issue has been protection. It has been something that this is one of the best O-lines in the country. There's no doubt about that. They have been really, really good for about 95% of the season. And then you play Georgia, and you get absolutely dominated. You give up 13 sacks and 25 tackles for loss in 2 games. It just can't happen. And some of that is Quinn Ewers' mobility. Some of that is his, injury to his ankle. A lot of that, plays into all this stuff. Some of that is just the offensive line missing assignments. So this is the one, to me, in the grand scheme of things for the playoff, I'm probably least worried about, at least in terms of the offensive line, because I know that's a very good unit. I know that Georgia presents something that they obviously really, really struggle with, but pretty much no one else has throughout the entire year. They've been able to be very, very efficient throughout the year, and I tend to believe they will be fine on the offensive line. Will Quinn Ewers' mobility put him in tough positions? That's another question to be asked, and definitely something that kind of plays into this equation. And then, obviously, the protection issues lead to turnovers. You're going to have turnovers when you have protection issues, particularly with a guy like Quinn Ewers that does struggle with his footwork at times, does struggle to get his feet under him to release the ball the way that he wants to. In this pick right here with Dalen Everett late in that game against Georgia, the offensive lineman gets pushed back into his lap. He's not able to step into that throw. It kind of floats out there, and Dalen Everett makes a play on it. So you're in a position where you don't have the most mobile quarterback in the world. You're not in a position where you are in a position where he is going to make mistakes when he's under pressure, when he's in tough situations, and you just can't have that. In a playoff format where you have so many teams that are so efficient offensively and are so willing to take chances that you give them and take full advantage of them, you cannot give them as many chances as Quinn Ewers gave Georgia on Saturday, as he's given a couple other teams throughout the year. He's had an INT in the last 2 games. He had 3 games with no INTs before that. So that's the question. He has 3 touchdowns and 4 INTs when under pressure, 22 touchdowns and 5 INTs when he is fully clean. You got to keep him clean. You got to make sure that the pressure does not get there. He's got to be better about moving in the pocket. And then when he does release a ball, he cannot release it off weird footing. That is something that continues to happen with him. And if it does continue to happen, there are going to be picks by Clemson. There are going to be big plays by Clemson. And then you might just come out on the wrong side and be heading home in the very first round of this playoff. So this is probably the biggest thing. I talked about it when we were heading into this game against Georgia. If Texas can take care of the football during this tournament, they can they can absolutely win the national title. They have that ability. They have the defense to do it. They have to make sure they don't put their defense in bad spots. They did on Saturday. They cannot do it throughout this tournament, or they're going to be in a terrible, terrible place in that Clemson game or possibly that Arizona State game if they're able to get through Clemson. And then finally, the biggest one, or not the biggest one, but one of them is explosive pass plays. It was not nearly as good as you wanted it to be. He has one of the lowest average depth of target in the entire power forward as Quinn Ewers. Some of that is just what Sark's offense is. Dylan Gabriel's also all the way down there, so not like this is necessarily crazy news, but it's definitely something that you want to get fixed. It's definitely something that you want to test more people deep downfield, because 34.1 completion percentage on 20 plus yard passes downfield. On Saturday, he was 8 for 17 with 2 interceptions on passes beyond 10 yards downfield. It can't happen. It needs to be a little bit better. Some of that is protection. Some of that is just Quinn Ewers has to make better balls. He has to hit his receivers in stride. He has to be a lot better about pushing the ball downfield and doing it with a lot of confidence. He made a couple of really incredible throws against Georgia, especially this one to Matthew Golden, but he's got to do it more often. They got to be able to scheme that stuff up, and a lot of that does have to do with the run game, having to be a little bit bigger of a factor, pull those safeties and linebackers down into the box, and then you can throw over top of them. A lot of this kind of plays together. So that's kind of the big question here is, how much of this is really on Quinn Ewers? How much of this sits firmly on his shoulders, and how much of this is just kind of an amalgamation of a million different things? So for me, the mobility is a very real issue. There's no doubt about that. The offensive line, there have been times, even in that first Georgia game, there was a sack where I believe Jalen Walker, late in that game near the end zone, Quinn Ewers needed to step up in the pocket. There was an open pocket for him to step up, move to the left, and make a throw. When he doesn't do that, he puts himself in really tough positions. He throws things flat-footed. He floats passes. INTs happen. One almost happened against Georgia in this exact scenario where he just didn't get his feet under him. He just didn't fully set his feet. It was not necessarily where the ball needed to be, and almost got picked. It was dropped, obviously, but he puts it in harm's way far too often when he has those mobility issues. So that is a problem. There's no doubt about that. The O-line also needs to hold up their end of the bargain. They have not necessarily done that quite as much in the run game as you would like. They've missed a couple of different pass pro things that you definitely cannot miss in the playoff, and it's definitely something that if you're not going to have a successful O-line, you're not going to have a successful offense, plain and simple. And then the deep balls are a conversation. There's no doubt about that. You're going to have to stretch the field just a little bit during this tournament. It doesn't necessarily need to be 10 times per game. It doesn't need to be beating them over the top every single play. You do need to make them respect it a little bit more, because right now they don't really respect your run game. They don't really respect the deep ball. They're being able to play everything pinned in, everything from 10 yards in. that makes it relatively easy for these very talented, very good tacklers to go in and make those plays on these really talented pass catchers, but you're putting them in situations where they're catching the ball and they're looking downfield to 10 defenders right in front of them. So there's a lot of different things that do sit on Quinn Ewers' shoulders. There are certain things that he does that does hurt this offense, whether it's his mobility, some of that is injury-based, some of that is just who he is as a quarterback. Some of it is the O-line not being quite as good in big-time moments as they need him to be, the run game not being very consistent, some play calling issues in the red zone area has been a big factor in this. So not all of this is on Quinn Ewers. I can promise you that. There is some that is on Quinn Ewers, no doubt about it, and he does need to be better. But the reality is he is a quarterback that if you give him good protection, if you give him a run game, he will be one of the best quarterbacks in the country. If all of that starts to break down and pressure starts to get home, things turn sour really, really quickly. So it really just comes down to that offensive line, that run game being able to step up. Now, you need a little bit of help for that. You might need a little bit of help to figure out all of those issues. So what does Arch Manning bring to the table that Quinn Ewers just doesn't quite? The biggest thing to me is run game numbers. When you talk about the run game in college football, really in any level of football, you are looking at a numbers game inside the box and in your backfield. Whether or not if you have 5 blockers and they have 6 guys in the box, you want to make sure you have 7 guys that could possibly take the ball or possibly be blocking on the play. So let's say it's a read option with Trey Wisner and Arch Manning. That linebacker has to think for one more second, is Arch Manning going to pull this ball? Is Arch Manning going to pull it, run around me, and go for 66 yards like he does on this very play that I have right here? But he's a very, very talented runner. He will make all of those linebackers, all of those safeties come down into the box, make sure they respect the run game with him, and then other run lanes will open for these running backs, and then he will be able to make a couple of plays with his legs. So that's a huge part of this. He does bring run game numbers. He does bring an athleticism that Quinn Ewers just doesn't have. That's just not part of his game. He has plenty of other things that he does way better than what Arch Manning does, but the athleticism part of this is a huge part and definitely something that can factor into what Texas can do offensively in this thing. And then you do have the deep ball potential. He's been absolutely incredible, pushing the ball down the field, 8 for 18, 327 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 1 INT on 20-plus yard passes, 11 for 18, 228 yards. He had 6 touchdowns, 1 INT on 10-plus yards passes. Remarkable player. He obviously has an ability to push the ball down the field. The arm talent is absolutely incredible and definitely something that he brings to the table. So it can't just be run plays. It can't just be, oh, number 16's coming in, so let's pack into the box and let's make sure we defend the run. You got to diversify it, and that deep ball is definitely something that he can diversify it with. So my idea, and I want to make it very clear before I get into my idea, I have not called football. I am not Steve Sarkisian. I am not anywhere near Steve Sarkisian. He has forgotten more about the sport than I will ever know. The reality is, I think everyone can watch this team and see something is missing on offense, and something is just a little bit off. There needs to be more packages for Arch Manning in the CFP. If you think Arch Manning should be the starter for this team, I'm sorry, you're just wrong. Quinn Ewers gives them the best chance to win the national title. You have to utilize Arch Manning, though. I don't know if that's a 70-30 split, an 80-20 split, especially in the red zone. I would utilize him a little bit more to get numbers in the run game. A lot of different things to kind of take into effect here. The reality is you got to see Arch Manning more. Number 16 has to come on the field a little bit more often. The run game has to utilize him to get a couple of openings for these running backs, to get this offensive line to get pushing downfield. And then utilize that arm. Let him rip the ball downfield a couple of times, make those safeties worried about the run game, and then let him pull one back and absolutely let one rip. Quinn Ewers should still be the leader. Quinn Ewers is the outright leader of this team. Benching him would almost guarantee that you do not win a national title. But you got to get Arch Manning in there. You have to diversify that quarterback position. And if you don't, you're probably in a position where you're coming up short against another elite team in Oregon or Ohio State when you get to that semifinal, or maybe even a little bit earlier. So this is going to be the thing that decides this tournament for Texas one way or the other. How they handle this situation, how much Arch Manning gets into the game, how they utilize him, all of that stuff. It is an absolute tightrope walk. It is going to be incredibly tough for Steve Sarkisian to do, but he's got to do it. If he wants to win a national title, this is a must. There's no two ways about that, and it'll be interesting to see how all of that plays out. But we'll take our second break here, and when we come back, we got to get to some coaching carousel updates, including one around UNC and Bill Belichick that I'm still having trouble figuring out. But we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.